So now I want to say officially, of course, to say welcome and virtually welcome to Ethiopian Graduate School of Theology. We have enjoyed working through your book and challenging, refreshing, and of course, a number of new insights, new ideas. And my students, most of them, I can say all of them, they really enjoyed working through the ideas. Very challenging. So now they have questions, of course, because you are here to answer their questions. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tedla, for arranging this opportunity to have Dr. William Lane Craig with us today. And Dr. Craig, we appreciate your willingness to join us and address our questions regarding your book today. I want to express my gratitude for the chance to hear directly from you. It's truly an honor. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's a delight to be with you.
Thank you. So I have two questions. Let me start with the first one. In the book of Philippians, chapter 2, verse 7, it states that Jesus emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form.
Yes.
So which human form did Jesus take to serve as atonement? In your book, it says he served us as an atonement. So which human form did Jesus take as to serve as an atonement, especially if the atonement extends to even the earliest archaic humans? That's my first.
Okay. I think I understand your question. Well, clearly, Jesus was not a Neanderthal or a Denisovan. He was a first century Palestinian Jew. So he took that form of a human being. But the emphasis of the book is that all of these different types of human being are fully human. They are body, soul entities that are created in the image of God, and the relatively small anatomical differences that separate us are trivialities. It's of no significance that one type of human had high brow ridges, for example, or a different sort of cleft in the skull at one point. These anatomical differences are trivial in comparison with their similarity and with the soul that they all have. So I would say that Jesus is an ordinary human being that comprises both a hominin body and a soul, and that he was a Homo sapiens.
Okay. The reason I ask this question is that if the atonement covers the whole humanity, including those archaic species like Neanderthals and the rest, and if we say he's in the form of Homo sapiens, like a normal human being, will the atonement cover their sin?
Yes, in the book, I'm very explicit that I think we will see Neanderthals in heaven and Denisovans, that these archaic human beings are fully human, and that therefore they were covered by the atoning death of Christ, which is on behalf of every individual created in the image of God, as they were.
Okay.
Okay, you are done. Now we move to Samson.
Can I proceed to the second question?
Oh, okay, so that was the first one. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So the second one goes, how can the concept of the image of God, whether substantialistic, relational, or functional, be applied to Homo heidelbergensis, considering that they appear to be in an evolutionary preceding the fully developed human form? I was just looking at some data, and I found out that after heidelbergensis, there is still evolution progress on human beings. So how can we apply this concept of image of God?
I think that would be a mistake to think that they were somehow underdeveloped human forms and that we are more fully developed. We're differently developed, but that's the result of various environmental and other factors that don't necessarily represent improvements. For example, some have speculated that the anatomical differences of Neanderthals was due to the fact that they lived during the Ice Age, and therefore their large noses were helpful in respiration in that sort of cold climate, and their stocky build also helped them to survive. So I don't think we should anyway think that these people were underdeveloped. And so I also think, as you know from the book, that we are in God's image, not in virtue of our hominin bodies. We share similar anatomy with other primates, but rather what makes us in the image of God is our rational soul. Only human beings are persons. Now I'm hearing some interference from some other mic, but
I muted it now.
okay. Only human beings are rational souls, moral agents capable of making moral choices. And so anyone who exhibits that kind of capacity would be in God's image, regardless of their anatomical developments. The anatomy is necessary for being a human person, but not for being a person. So angels, for example, I would say are persons, but they're not human persons. They don't have a hominin body.
And speaking of the image of God, you kind of accept that humanity shares some ontological similarity with God. That helps us to be in some kind of relationship. So there's ontological, that word was kind of problematic for his understanding. How can we be ontologically similar to God?
In virtue of having a rational soul, we are persons just as God is personal. We have self-consciousness, rationality, intentionality, moral agency. In all of these respects, we are like God in being personal beings. And that differentiates us from the rest of the animal creation. There are no other non-human persons in the animal world around us.
Okay, so one more question from him I have here. Just taking into account the breath of God.
The breath
yes.
of God?
Yes.
Like the Spirit of God?
Okay. Like God breathing, to Adam, that kind of speech. So that kind of figurative speech, can that be understood as a genetic switch?
Can be understood as what?
A genetic switch, genetic mutation.
Oh.
Yes.
Oh, I think that is a hermeneutic, Tedla, that we should not adopt. That is a hermeneutic of concordism, where one tries to read modern science into these ancient texts.
Okay.
And it seems to me that that's a mistake. We should just let the text stand on its own and be interpreted as its original author and audience would have understood it, rather than saying, well, here is the genetic material being infused into Adam, or here is biological evolution, or the Big Bang, or things of that sort. I think that that's a wrong hermeneutical approach to these ancient documents.
Thank you for this clarification. For everyone, including myself, this is a good reminder. So when Craig interprets Genesis 1 through 11 as mythistory, he doesn't bring scientific terminologies there. So that's a good reminder. So we should stay away from bringing scientific terminologies to the Genesis 1 through 11, especially when we do the interpretation. Thank you for that clarification. And then I think we can move on to the next question. And Tager is the next one.
Thanks, Dr. Greg. It's a privilege to have you here. So I have a couple of questions. Let me begin from the first one. You define humanness anthropologically based on the human brain size, while the theological perspective defines humanness as being a living soul created by the breath of God. Your approach may not be fully accepted within Christian society, maybe in particular, the conservative Christian society. So how do you reconcile this perspective?
Now, if I understood you, I think you said that a human person or being is a soul of some sort. And I wouldn't agree with that. I think that the soul is what makes us personal. It's what makes us a person. But when you read Genesis, it is man as a whole that is created in the image of God. Both body and soul represent man as being in God's image. And so to be a human person, I think you need to take into account the human body. We need to have a hominin body that is roughly anatomically like ours. Otherwise, we could be a person belonging to some other type of being. For example, if there is extraterrestrial life, say Klingons, as in the old Star Trek program, then Klingons would be persons like us, but they wouldn't be human persons. They wouldn't be human beings. They would be a different kind of person. And so it's, I think, essential to humanness that we take account of both the body as well as the soul. Now, does that address your question, or did I misunderstand?
Maybe in your book, I mean, you defined it anthropologically considering the size of the brain.
Yes, that's part of it. That's part of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes, the brain capacity would be a necessary condition of human personhood, I think, because an undersized brain, such as you find in chimpanzees, just doesn't have the neurological complexity to support self-consciousness and rationality and so forth. And so that's why I'm very skeptical that some of these early types classed as homo, like Homo habilis or Homo naledi, are really human beings. I suspect they are just very advanced non-human primates because they don't have the neurological capacity to support a rational soul.
Okay, to the next question.
Okay, thanks. Let me ask the next question. Okay. There are tribes in Ethiopia here and elsewhere. You can consider maybe Papua New Guinea.
Yes.
So who have not developed sophisticated technologies, but they are Homo sapiens. In your view, these Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals and the Denisovans are all humans. However, this seems problematic because no evidence suggests Neanderthals could have engaged in philosophy and science. So still tribes here in Ethiopia, if they are given the opportunity, could have developed, I mean, everything other humans could do. How do you see this? I mean,
yes, I think that Neanderthals, Denisovans had a fully modern cognitive capacity, so that if you had a time machine and could bring one of them to today, he would be able to master these disciplines. And this is not just speculation on my part. This is actually demonstrated. For example, when the European colonists first came to American shores, the Native American Indians were still living literally in the Stone Age. They had the same tools and technology that Homo heidelbergensis did 750,000 years ago. These were Stone Age peoples. And yet these Native Americans had cognitive capacity that was every bit as great as the colonists. One of them, very famous Indian named Squanto, actually went to England with the colonists, where he entered into domestic service and became the chief butler of a grand British household, learned English fluently. Eventually, he chose to go back to America and return to living with his native people, but he was every bit the cognitive equal of these advanced European thinkers. In fact, I don't know if you're aware of this people group today. Have you ever heard of the Andaman Islands? The Andaman,
never heard of it. Never.
the Andaman Islands are a series of islands that are incredibly isolated in the Indian Ocean. And these people are Stone Age people. There is international agreements that prohibit anyone from visiting or coming into contact with the Andaman Islanders for fear that it would corrupt their indigenous culture. And so no one is allowed to visit these islands or go to them. And yet these are clearly people just like us. They are our cognitive equals, even though they haven't had the same degree of cultural evolution. So one of the emphases I have in the book is that there's a huge difference between biological evolution and cultural evolution. And you can have the biological and cognitive capacity for modern technology, but that cultural evolution may just have never occurred in your local area because the environment didn't call it forth. It wasn't needed or important for survival value. And so cultures can exhibit huge time lags compared to the cognitive capacity of the people involved. And this may be the case for the people groups that you mentioned.
Thanks for the answer. But the reason why I raised this question is, here we have a tribe called Mursi, and we have people from the area. They are given the chance, and they have performed well. Even some are in US, working as a professor. And the other reason why mentioning this question is raising this question is Neanderthals failed to survive because of their brain capacity. And the Homo sapiens existed, survived due to their brain capacity, but the Neanderthals could not make it. That's the reason. Could they be able to, do the philosophy or science if they were given the chance?
Yeah, yes, I think so. I don't think that Neanderthals became extinct because of a lack of cognitive capacity. I have never seen any paleoanthropologist defend or even suggest such a view. When you look at their tool industries that they had, they were advanced, they were well adapted. We don't know what caused Neanderthals and Denisovans to eventually go extinct, but I think it would be extraordinary for anyone to suggest that this was due to a lack of cognitive capacity.
Oh, okay.
That's good.
Thank you so much.
Very good
Thank you so much.
So, Ruben, you are next.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Craig. It's truly an honor to have this opportunity to speak with you. Thank you, Dr. Tedla. Without further ado, let me directly go to my question. So I was wondering, Dr. Craig, how do you reconcile if there is a potential conflict between scientific consensus and biblical interpretation when you are addressing metaphysical inequities?
How do I reconcile the conflict between biblical teaching and scientific evidence or interpretation?
When you are addressing metaphysical inquiries or challenges.
Yeah. Well, now, help me to understand your point here. The whole thesis of the book, In Quest of the Historical Atom, was that the existence of a single human pair from whom all humanity that has ever lived on this planet is descended is fully consistent with the scientific evidence. That if such a human pair lived earlier than 500,000 years ago, then that is not ruled out by population genetics. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but since the book was published in the fall of 2023, new studies done by Chinese population geneticists show that between around 800, 700,000 years ago, in fact, the human population on this planet did go through a population bottleneck that reduced the breeding population to less than 1,300 individuals over a period of 100,000 years. And so it's not simply that it's possible that this happened. The evidence indicates that there was such a population bottleneck, and that average over 100,000 years is entirely consistent with the existence of a primordial single pair from whom all humanity descended. So at least with respect to this particular issue, I think that the biblical teaching is fully in accord with the deliverances of paleoanthropology. Now, more broadly speaking, since I think that the proper genre analysis of Genesis 1 to 11 is mytho-history, I'm not troubled by the fact that Genesis describes a worldwide flood that wiped out all terrestrial life on Earth, save for that aboard the ark, because I don't take that narrative literally. If you took that literally, I think that would be in irremediable conflict with the deliverances of modern science to suggest that sometime within human history, there was a worldwide flood that wiped out all terrestrial life on Earth, except that aboard the ark, would be scientifically impossible. But by treating these narratives as mytho-history, I'm able to give a non-literal interpretation of the flood story, which would be consistent with it being, say, a local flood.
Okay, Robert, the next question.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Craig. Let me read the second question. So, how do alternative interpretation of Adam and Eve narrative impact our understanding of God's character and his relationship with humanity?
In relation to God's character, I guess I don't see any conflict here with God's character, his creation of human beings in his image to rule this planet is fully consistent with his character. The only inconsistency with his character might be if you subscribe to some sort of doctrine of original sin, according to which Adam's sin was imputed to every one of his posterity, so that they are each guilty for the sin that Adam committed, not just for their own sins. They're condemned for what Adam did. Now, I think that that's a defensible doctrine, however, if we think of Adam as our representative appointed by God to stand before him on our behalf. So I think that that is reconcilable with God's character, even though I'm not persuaded myself that the Bible does teach a doctrine of original sin in the sense of culpability for Adam's sin. But are you thinking of some other character conflict that I'm not seeing?
No, doctor, maybe I was not clear. Thank you for explaining, but I was wondering if this alternative interpretation of Adam Eve, how can it help us to understand the relationship between God and humanity? That was my question, maybe, if I...
Between God and humanity.
Yeah, the alternative interpretation of Adam and Eve.
Okay, well, now, let me try to see if I can get at this question. We've already said that this narrative implies that human beings are created in the image of God and therefore intrinsically valuable. You remember that after the flood, capital punishment is prescribed for anyone who takes a human life because man is in God's image, and therefore we do not have the right to murder other innocent people. So being created in the image of God is what makes us intrinsically valuable as human beings, and is why human beings should be treated as ends rather than merely means to an end. Now, beyond that, I think that the universal progenitorship of Adam and Eve is really crucial theologically, and this is what differentiates my view from Josh Swamidas's view, which lacks universal progenitorship. I think universal progenitorship is critical because it shows what God's original plan was for humanity. His original intention was to bless the entire human race. And when that was aborted by the fall, God chose then plan B, so to speak, another plan which would involve calling Israel to be a special nation set apart for himself, with a view through Israel of fulfilling his original universal intention to bless all of mankind. So God's original plan for humanity has not been abandoned. His intention for mankind is still this universal plan. And therefore, the universal progenitorship of Adam and Eve, I think, is theologically significant in disclosing to us God's primary intention for the human race.
Sure.
Okay. So
Thank you so much.
okay, the next person is Mulukan. Please ask.
Thank you, Dr. Craig, and for having you here on our platform.
Sure.
And my question is, I've read the 13th chapter. I think that's the last chapter of Historic Adam, the quest for Historic Adam. And what I've found out there is that Adam and Eve were taught as if they did not hold the full image of God upon creation and needed to undergo some genetic modifications. So in that case, would that not be a way of undermining the creative power of God somehow? And how are they going to be capable of carrying out their functional and relational agency of God here on earth with that understated personhood?
My view is that God, being all-powerful, has the ability and free will either to create things ex nihilo, out of nothing, or else to use prior materials to create something new. And so I don't think there's any incompatibility between God's power and saying that God used a pre-human hominid to bring about the creation of the first two humans through some sort of systemic genetic mutation that radically altered his neurological capacity. I think that that is entirely consistent with God's power. And moreover, I think that it's actually quite consistent with the biblical text, because when you read the story of Adam's creation, God doesn't create Adam out of nothing. He doesn't say, and God said, let there be a man in the garden. And there was a man in the garden, and God saw that it was good. He doesn't create Adam ex nihilo. He shapes material, pre-existing material, the dust of the earth, into a human form, and then breathes into its nostrils the breath of life, and Adam comes to be a living being. So I think that that is a figurative or metaphorical narrative of God's using some kind of pre-existent form to create the first human being. And that would be, I think, entirely consistent with saying that Adam and Eve had pre-human ancestors. Now, I want to hasten ahead. That's not the thesis of my book. I am not committing myself to that view. I'm leaving it an open question. I think that it's theologically open to saying either God created them ex nihilo, de novo, or that he created them out of some pre-human hominid form.
Yeah, the other question I want to pose is there are scientific claims that Earth has been, humans has been created some millions of years ago. And in your thesis, you have said it's around 400,000 years since the Earth was created. And how did you try to reconcile if there are some pushbacks from the scientific circle on that? How did you justify or explain for them the young Earth creationist view?
Having taken the position that the literary genre of Genesis 1 to 11 is mytho-history, and therefore not to be interpreted in a literalistic way, I approached the scientific evidence with a completely open mind. And so what I wanted to do was to find out when paleoanthropologists first think that fully human beings appeared on this planet. And I approached that with a completely open mind. And what I found, as I said, is that early Homo forms like Homo habilis and Homo naledi and even Homo erectus, at least in his early development, didn't seem to be fully human. You have to understand that whether these early forms are lumped into Homo or into Australopithecines is pretty arbitrary. So what one has to do is look for these telltale signs of human cognitive capacities that would indicate we have here a fully human being. And those cognitive capacities seem to first emerge around the time of Homo heidelbergensis, or Homo antecessor would be a sister species to Homo heidelbergensis. But to place it at Homo sapiens is far too late. When you look at the technology that Neanderthals and Homo heidelbergensis exhibited, and the cave art in particular, nobody who looks at the cave art can deny that this was done by human persons, not by animals. It seems to me that we are driven back as far as Homo heidelbergensis about 750,000 years ago or so. And so I'm taking my cue here from what the best evidence of paleoanthropology requires.
Bill, I have
Thank
one
you.
question just related to this one. Since you are talking to Ethiopians, did you think anything about Lucy?
About what? Lucy. Yeah,
Say
Lucy
something
would have
about
been
Lucy.
a primate, a non-human primate, not a human being.
Okay, so you didn't discuss a lot about it. Okay, the next person is Yashi. Please ask.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Creek. Let me read my question. Does the righteous lives of Enoch, Noah, and Abraham, who worked with God in the Old Testament, contradict with the New Testament, that is, all have sinned and fallen short of glory of God? Here, what do you think the concept of original sin?
Okay, again, Tedla, I didn't understand her question. Can you help me to understand what was it?
I will read her question, and then it's about original sin. So, does the righteous, she's talking about Enoch, Noah, and Abraham in the Old Testament,
Yes.
who walked with God, in some kind of good relationship. So we go to the New Testament, where we read all have sinned, and she's talking about everyone sinning. Now she's asking you about the question, the issue of the original sin, whether that applies to those people who lived, I think, long ago.
Oh, well, if you hold to a doctrine of original sin, that would underline how theologically important the universal progenitorship of Adam and Eve is, because as the first human beings, their sin is imputed to all of their descendants, and their descendants inherit a corrupted nature from them. So the origin of the human race in a single pair is really vital if you want to hold to a doctrine of original sin. Now, as I say in the first chapter of the book, I don't think that the biblical evidence for the doctrine of original sin is very powerful. Now, certainly I believe there was a fall. There was an original sin in the sense that Adam and Eve fell into sin, and thereby sin came into the human race and spread throughout the human race. But in Genesis 2 and 3, the story of the fall, and in Romans 5, which is Paul's discussion of the fall, in neither passage do you find the doctrine of original guilt taught, I think, that Adam's sin is imputed to all of his descendants. Rather, what Paul says is that death spread to all men because all men sinned. So the curse of death is the result of people sinning themselves, not the result of Adam's sin. So while I think that the doctrine of original sin, if you hold to it, does require a historical Adam and Eve, I don't regard that as a very powerful argument for Adam and Eve, because I don't see that the doctrine of original guilt and corruption is clearly taught in either the New Testament or the Old Testament.
Okay, we move to the next person. Abraham, you can ask. You have a couple of questions, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Craig.
Yes.
So my question is related with a question that my sister asked. That is, my question is mainly concerned with free will and predestination.
Yes.
So when we talk about original sin is often associated with the debate between free will and predestination. The question I often confront is whether the tendency to sin is consequence of the fall of Adam and Eve, or if it's a result of my own free will. I'm asking this question because I'm working my thesis original sin. This question, that's why I'm asking.
All right. Now, if I understand, your microphone was cutting out a little bit, but you were asking, is our tendency to sin the result of Adam and Eve's sin?
Sure.
Okay. This is a very popular and natural view, I think, to hold. But honestly, again, when I read what it says in Romans chapter 5, I do not find Paul teaching this. I don't see that he teaches that as a result of Adam and Eve's sin, that human nature was somehow corrupted so that we are born with a morally corrupted nature. And in fact, when you reflect on this, that's very difficult to understand, because how could a moral corruption be passed on biologically? That seems bizarre. It's not, sin isn't in our genes. Otherwise, you could have some sort of genetic engineering go on to create perfect human beings and excise sin. St. Augustine thought that original sin or corruption was passed on through the semen in sexual intercourse. And I don't think anyone holds that today. That not only promotes a very negative view of human sexuality, but it just is unintelligible how moral qualities could be passed on through the semen or through a woman's egg. So it seems to me that this doctrine is neither taught in the Bible, nor is it intelligible. And so here's an alternative that I want to suggest, okay? Here's an alternative to explain our tendency to sin. As biological animals, we have a built-in tendency towards self-preservation. Any organism that lacked such a tendency would not be able to survive. You have to have an inner drive to self-preservation if you're to survive and produce offspring. Now, in human beings, in moral creatures like ourselves, this tendency to self-preservation can exhibit itself as selfishness, self-centeredness, indifference to the plight of others, and a total self-orientation, which results in sin. And so in that sense, there would be this built-in tendency towards self-preservation that would manifest itself as a kind of selfishness that would be sinful. Moreover, each human infant is born into a culture and a society that is permeated by sin, so that not only is there this inner tendency to self-preservation and selfishness, but he also learns sin by imitation of those around him. Now, in the case of Adam and Eve, prior to the fall, there is a view within Roman Catholicism that I find rather plausible and attractive. Roman Catholic theologians believe that prior to the fall, Adam and Eve enjoyed a kind of superadded grace from God, which gave them the ability to control their biological impulses so as to live a holy and righteous life before God. But when Adam and Eve fell, this gift of God's superadded grace was lost. They were estranged from God, now alienated from God, separated from him, and no longer had this gift of God's grace that would enable them to master their biological impulses and the lower impulses of their soul. And so as a result, man is literally out of control, and he gives in to these biological impulses that result in sin. And then this affects society, and by imitation, then every human being born into society perpetuates this kind of behavior. So I would find that to be a very plausible account of the fall. It's not that the corruption of Adam and Eve is passed on from descendant to descendant, but it's rather that there was a loss of something. There was a loss of this gift of God's grace that they had in the state of innocence that now leaves us victims to our lower nature and biological impulses.
May I ask you one question in connection to this?
Yeah.
So, Bill, when you talk about selfishness, do you have anything to say about the selfish genes from Richard Dawkins' work in connection to this, maybe?
I am not sufficiently familiar with Dawkins' work, but I think that it would be very much in accord with what I just said.
Yes.
The idea of the selfish gene, that these genes aim to reproduce, and that is all they're aiming to do, is to reproduce, to make more themselves. Now, I think where it's implausible is we shouldn't think that evolution operates on the genes rather than the organism as a whole. It is the whole organism that has this drive towards self-preservation, and hence in humans, selfishness. It's not the selfish gene, it's the selfish human. But it would be very much in accord with what he's wanting to say here, I think.
Yeah, so it would be very interesting to see if the selfish genes for Richard Dawkins explain what they do, and then if we bring that idea to moral corruption, selfishness, then morality would be reduced to more or less to biology.
Well, it would mean that we have a built-in biological tendency toward bad behavior. And that seems to me to be very plausible.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the way we get angry and violent. And, well, you look at the animal kingdom, and it exhibits all sorts of behavior that if human beings did that, we would describe it as profoundly immoral. But for animals, it's not immoral because they're not moral agents. They're just doing what comes naturally. But in humans, this then becomes immoral. It becomes sin because we are moral agents, unlike animals. Mere animals.
Okay, one more question connected to this discussion. Moral corruption, how we can inherit moral corruption from Adam and Eve through the fall. There was a discussion here. So what's your view about the human soul? How do we get our souls? Is this biological? Yeah. So I'm just trying to see a connection. If we can get our souls through biological mechanism,
yes,
then there is some connection.
Predecessor at Huntington,
yes,
William Hasker, is well known for his work on the soul.
That's why I'm asking.
Pardon me?
That's why I'm bringing this up.
Okay, and on the origin of the soul. And let me say that I remain very open-minded about this. This is not an issue on which the Bible makes any sort of clarity. So this is going to be a philosophico-scientific question. And there are basically three views that I'm aware of that would be possibilities. One would be creationism, that God creates specially a new soul anytime a certain biological organism is born that has the neurological capacity to support a soul. So birds, mammals, tortoises, things like this would also have primitive souls that are created by God when these animals are conceived. The difficulty with that view is that it just seems unbelievable. It's easy to believe that God creates a new human soul every time human beings are born. But I just find myself incredulous when I think of all of the little turtles that hatch out of eggs on all of the beaches of the world, and that God is infusing little souls, into every one of these. It just seems incredible. Now, I appreciate that's not a sophisticated objection. It's just an argument from incredulity. It just seems unbelievable to think that this is what's going on. Also, when you think about scientists who are experimenting with frozen embryos, and they're fertilizing eggs in vitro and multiplying these frozen embryos, are they forcing God's hand to create a new soul in every one of these fertilized embryos that are then frozen? It maybe, but it strains credulity. Now, the other view, a second view, would be traducianism. And the traducian says that the soul of the parents produce the soul of the offspring, that in some way, soulish potentialities are carried by the sperm and the egg, so that when the sperm and egg unite, these soulish potentialities create a new soul. And so this view avoids the problem of God's constantly infusing new souls into the world all the time, because souls are begotten in the same way that bodies are begotten. The difficulty with traducianism is that it's really hard to make sense of souls being begotten by other souls. What are these soulish potentialities that are carried by the sperm or the egg that then give rise to a soul in the fertilized zygote? That's just not clear. So then the last view, the third view defended by Hasker, is emergentism. And this is the view that when the nervous system, and particularly the brain of an organism, achieves a certain degree of complexity, then there naturally emerges from the brain a new substance, a spiritual substance called a soul. And so this avoids creationism. It also avoids the obscurities of traducianism, and would see the production of souls as a natural process. But the difficulty of emergentism is that there's just no explanation of how purely physical mechanisms like neurons and synapses and so forth can produce an immaterial spiritual entity like a soul. And Hasker admits, he says, I have no explanation for this. I have no idea how this happens. He just postulates that it does. So all three of these views of the origin of the soul face real difficulties, and they might prompt us to abandon belief in the reality of the soul, except for the fact that, number one, I think the reality of the soul is clearly taught in the Bible. And number two, I think there are very good arguments in support of substance dualism and against physicalism. And so I am a dualist. I believe in the reality of the soul. But I've yet to see a fully persuasive account of the origin of the soul. And I'm waiting to see more work done by my colleagues on this subject.
Thank you so much. Can you accept one more question?
Yes.
Okay, Marsha, that's you. One question, and then I think it's time.
Okay. Thank you. Let me go to directly my question. If Genesis 1 to 11 is considered as mythistory, it raised the lingering question of whether the creation of Adam and Eve in God's image is mythical. So, what should be interpreted as a mythological, and which is a historical?
I do not think that the identification of Genesis 1 to 11 as mytho-history enables you to separate myth from history in these stories. It's more like a mixture of coffee and cream than a bag of red and black marbles. And in a mixture of coffee and cream, you can't just separate out which elements are which. The whole thing is mytho-history. Now, having said that, I do think there are certain clues as to when an element in the narrative is not meant to be taken literalistically, but figuratively. One of these clues would be when the narrative describes something that we know contradicts the belief of the author of the Pentateuch. For example, the premier example of this is we know the author of the Pentateuch believed that God is a transcendent being who has created the entire physical world. Because in Genesis 1:1, he says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the expression, the heavens and the earth, is a Hebrew idiom for all of physical reality. So God is not a physical being. He is a transcendent being who has created all the matter and energy in the universe. So when you come to Genesis 2 and 3, and this same author describes God in crass, anthropomorphic terms, like walking in the cool of the garden and calling out to Adam and Eve, who's hiding in the bushes, where are you? And so forth. I think we can be confident that the author did not take these narratives literally. He did not think that God is an anthropoid sort of physical creature. These are anthropomorphisms, such as you have also in the Psalms, where God is described with arms and eyes and ears and even nostrils breathing smoke, riding on the clouds like a chariot. The Hebrew scriptures use anthropomorphic descriptions of God to convey certain truths about God, but are not meant to be taken literally. And so when you have elements in the narratives that contradict what we know of the beliefs of the author of the Pentateuch, then I think we can be pretty sure that we're dealing with a figurative element in the narrative. Now, you might ask, well, why not think that Adam and Eve are purely figurative? Why not think that they are not literal people? And I think the answer to that is twofold. First of all, they're included in the genealogies in Genesis 1 to 11. The genealogies are the historical backbone of the primeval history that order the primeval narratives into a chronological sequence that melds seamlessly into the patriarchal narratives, the call of Abraham and the establishment of Israel. And in the same way that the Pentateuchal author regarded Abraham and his children and family as historical, so he regarded those earlier than Abraham in these genealogies to be real historical persons. And then secondly, in the New Testament, Paul and Jesus referred to Adam and Eve as real historical persons through whom sin entered the world, and death through sin. And if Adam were a purely literary figure or a figurative or fictional figure, he could not have causal effects outside the narrative. And yet Paul says Adam does have causal effects upon the real world in allowing sin to come into the world and death through sin. And so death reigned, he says, from Adam to Moses, even before the law was given. So although there are certain elements in the narratives that I think we should take figuratively, I don't think you can say that about Adam and Eve, because of their inclusion in the genealogies and because of Paul's teaching about the real world causal effects of Adam and Eve's sin.
Bill, time-wise, we are done, but I have one general question on behalf of my students. Is that okay? Just one question.
Yes, sure.
So this question is about this. So you are talking to Ethiopian theology students, and for your awareness, in Ethiopia, we have a huge influence of American evangelicalism, or even including fundamentalism. And there is this view about evolution. People are so, many people, evangelicals, are so worried about evolution, but you don't say anything about evolution in your book in terms of writing maybe a chapter or anything.
Yeah.
We can understand your approach, why you avoided it, but it would be good. This is your first opportunity to talk to Ethiopians, especially evangelicals in a graduate school. Would you say briefly just your take on what you think about evolution, or how you, something like that before you leave, so that they will have some idea, because we don't get that from your book.
This is such a huge question, Tedla. It's difficult to give a sound bite as an answer. I deal with this in my forthcoming systematic philosophical theology
Good.
in volume 3 on the doctrine of creation. I have a long excursus on the origin and evolution of life.
Okay.
And let me say this by way of summary. The word evolution is a sort of accordion word that can be stretched or collapsed in meaning depending on its context. And so the word evolution can refer to at least 3 things, and these are identified by the eminent evolutionary biologist Francisco Ayala. First, evolution can simply mean common descent, that all organisms today are genealogically related and go back to no more than a handful of common ancestors in the deep past. And it is in this sense that evolution is said to be a fact by biologists, simply that all living organisms are genealogically related and go back to common ancestors. And I don't see anything that is theologically unacceptable about that. I don't see anything in the Bible that would preclude that's being true. The second sense in which evolution is used is establishing the tree of life, to show how the various branches of organisms evolve from one another until you trace it back to the roots of this tree. This is not a fact among contemporary thinkers. The reconstruction of the tree of life is enormously controversial and the subject of some of the most acrimonious debates among evolutionary biologists. The third way in which evolution is used is the explanatory mechanisms for this evolution of life over the history of this planet. This, again, is a matter of great controversy today. Contrary to what you hear in the popular media, the so-called modern synthesis or neo-Darwinism is now passing off the scene. It was challenged in the late 1980s and now is widely rejected. Today, evolutionary biologists are searching for some sort of what they call extended evolutionary synthesis that will replace the modern synthesis. But it is widely recognized today that the old modern synthesis of explaining evolution in terms of random mutation and natural selection, the sort of theory defended by Richard Dawkins, is now obsolete and needs to be radically revised. And so this third area of evolution is also a matter of great controversy and is fully consistent with some sort of progressive creationism where God intervened along the way to produce new results that would not have resulted in the absence of such supernatural intervention. So that is a wide open question today. And that is usually the point of issue between those who are skeptical of evolutionary theory and those who are advocates of evolutionary theory. It isn't usually about common descent. It's usually about those explanatory mechanisms, which do remain a matter of great controversy.
So what does your book presuppose from the variety of views you just explained. Your book presupposes something from evolutionary biology or
Now,
paleontology.
you mentioned what
There is
presupposes?
some assumption in your book. You don't deal with evolution, of course, but you take it for granted.
Yeah.
But which form are you taking for granted?
I take it for granted in the book that human beings have evolved from pre-human hominins, and that therefore the thesis of common descent is true, that humans and chimpanzees both descend from a common ancestor about 5 to 6 million years ago. Now, I don't advocate that. I offer absolutely no evidence in support of that. But I'm just saying that if you believe that, there is no incompatibility with the belief in Adam and Eve as real historical people. You can believe in the thesis of common ancestry and that we and chimpanzees have a common ancestor and still believe that all of humanity is descended from a single human pair, whom I identify with Homo heidelbergensis.
Great. So you gave us more than an hour, so I think I should stop here. And I want to thank you on behalf of my students. And of course, I want to thank you personally as well for accepting this invitation. And this was a very great honor. And you know, you are so much loved in Ethiopia. There are many.
I can't even imagine. It's been a pleasure to be with you. And I want to say particularly to those of you who are in Ethiopia, that you are on the front lines today. I know with both the challenge of Islam as well as the challenge of secularism, you face foes on both the right and the left, and that it can be very costly. And so I just want to thank you for being valiant soldiers for Jesus Christ today, and to keep up the good work, and may God greatly use you in Ethiopia and throughout Africa.
Thank you so much for your work, for the kingdom, and for, of course, being with us for this interaction with you. And thank you so much again.
Thank you, Tedla.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay, bye.